Chapter 1. A Disturbing Invitation. The rain had begun to fall in a slow, deliberate rhythm against the windows of our modest flat in London. It was the kind of evening that encouraged one to settle by the fire with a good book, or in Poirot's case, to spend an inordinate amount of time arranging his cufflinks with mathematical precision. I had just poured myself a second cup of tea when I heard the distinct flap of an envelope landing on the floor. With a sigh, I set my cup down and retrieved the post. Among the usual assortment of bills and unremarkable correspondence was one that caught my attention immediately. The envelope was thick, expensive, and bore an unmistakable scrawl on its front. "From Harold Graves," I murmured, frowning. Poirot, who had been occupied in examining the alignment of a salt and pepper set, looked up with interest. "Ah, an old acquaintance of yours, Hastings?" "An old acquaintance of yours as well," I corrected. "You remember Graves? He was an inspector when we worked on the Arlington jewel theft case." Poirot took the letter from me, turning it over in his hands with careful scrutiny before slicing it open with a neat, practiced motion. As his eyes scanned the page, his usual air of self-satisfaction faded. "What does he say?" I asked. Poirot read aloud, his voice unusually quiet. "Poirot, you must come at once. A terrible thing has happened. I cannot explain in writing. There is no one else I trust. If I am correct, my life may be in grave danger. Time is short." There was no signature. I sat down heavily. "Graves was never one for dramatics," I said. "For him to write like this, something must be very wrong." Poirot remained silent, staring at the letter as if he could will it to reveal more than what was written. Then, with great care, he placed it on the table and smoothed the edges with his fingertips. "Interesting," he murmured. "Most interesting." I watched him expectantly. "Well, what do you make of it?" Poirot leaned back, templed his fingers, and regarded me with that sharp, bird-like expression that always preceded one of his deductions. "Tell me, Hastings, does it not strike you as peculiar?" I blinked. "What?" "The wording, the tone. This is not the way a man writes when he merely suspects trouble." No, this is a letter from someone who knows." I considered this. "You mean he had already uncovered something?" "Précisément. Our friend Graves had discovered a truth that someone would prefer remain hidden. And now he fears for his life." I shifted in my chair. "Then we must go to him at once." "Poirot, we cannot ignore a plea like this." For a moment Poirot did not answer. He tapped a fingertip against the table, deep in thought. Then quite suddenly he nodded. "Yes, mon ami, we shall go," I exhaled in relief. "Splendid. I shall wire him immediately." "No," Poirot interrupted, shaking his head. "No telegram. If Graves was correct in his fears, then we must assume his movements were being watched. A reply may alert the wrong people." I hesitated. "Then how—" "We leave by the morning train," Poirot declared. He stood, adjusting the sleeves of his impeccable grey suit. "But first, Hastings, I must pack." I frowned. "Surely—" "That can wait?" Poirot gave me a reproachful look. "Ah, mon cher Hastings, you forget. I do not merely pack, I prepare. There is order and method, even in one's luggage." I chuckled, despite myself. "Well, at least you're predictable." Poirot only smiled. "Let us hope that our murderer is too." Outside, the rain continued to fall, as if whispering of secrets yet to be uncovered. Chapter 2. The Impossible Murder. The train to Little Marchwood was a slow and ponderous affair, winding its way through the English countryside as a fine mist clung to the landscape like a shroud. I found the journey rather tedious, but Poirot, ever the picture of patience, sat immaculately composed, his gloved hands resting atop his cane. His eyes were closed, yet I knew better than to think he was dozing. The little grey cells were at work. I glanced at the letter from Graves once more, as if expecting fresh meaning to reveal itself in the cryptic words. "It still baffles me," I muttered. If Graves truly feared for his life, why not alert the authorities? Why send only this desperate plea to you? Poirot opened one eye. Mon ami, the answer is elementary. He trusted no one. But he was a policeman, for heaven's sake, I protested. Surely he had colleagues, old friends. Poirot silenced me with a slight shake of the head. When a man of the law suspects he is about to be murdered, it is often because he has uncovered something that places him in the utmost danger. What if his suspicions implicated someone he once trusted? The idea sent a chill through me, and I found myself glancing out at the rolling fields, suddenly impatient for our arrival. When we at last reached Little Marchwood, we were greeted by an oppressive stillness. The village was charming in its way, with ivy-clad cottages and neat hedgerows, but there was something unnatural about the quiet. Even the birds seemed subdued. A police constable awaited us at the station, a lean man with a pinched face and a hesitant manner. "Monsieur Poirot?" he asked uncertainly. Poirot inclined his head. The constable's Adam's apple bobbed. "Best. Come with me straight away, sir." Poirot and I exchanged glances, but said nothing as we followed him. Inspector Graves's cottage stood at the end of a narrow lane, its whitewashed walls partially obscured by overgrown shrubbery. The front door stood ajar, a sight that sent a prickle of unease down my spine. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old books and pipe tobacco, overlaid with something far more sinister. Poirot came to a halt in the study doorway. Mon Dieu! The room was undisturbed, save for the figure slumped over the writing desk. Graves's silver hair was ruffled, his face half buried in the crook of his arm. A congealing pool of blood stained the blotter beneath him. I took a sharp breath. Murdered! Good Lord, Poirot, we were too late. Poirot did not answer. He stepped forward, his keen gaze sweeping the room. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned chair, no shattered glass. The French windows were locked from the inside. The door had been bolted before the constable forced it open. And then there was the chess piece. A single black king stood on the desk, deliberately placed beside Graves's outstretched hand. Poirot tapped his chin. A message, mon ami, but from whom? I swallowed, my throat dry. Could he have left it himself? Some kind of clue? Poirot bent over the desk, his fingers ghosting over the surface. Possible, but unlikely. The position, it is too precise, too deliberate. He turned to the constable. Who discovered the body? The man shifted uncomfortably. His housekeeper, Mrs. Hughes. She comes each morning, lets herself in with the back door key. Poor woman nearly fainted on the spot. Poirot nodded. And the local police? Chief Inspector Rowley's taken charge. He's in the next room. We found Rowley pacing before the fireplace, a solid man with a bristling moustache and the air of someone who would rather be anywhere else. Monsieur Poirot, he said, shaking his head. Nasty business, this. Man feared for his life, and now look at him. If only we'd known sooner. Poirot regarded him steadily. Had Graves reported any suspicions to you? Rowley hesitated. Not exactly. He mentioned a concern, said he was looking into something dangerous, but refused to elaborate. Said he'd have more to say when the time was right. Poirot's gaze sharpened. And now he will say nothing at all. I felt an uncomfortable weight settle in my chest. Poirot turned back toward the study, his expression unreadable. The chess piece, I ventured. Surely that must mean something. Poirot merely smiled. Everything means something more.
Me, the question is, what does it mean to the murderer? At that precise moment, the constable reappeared.
So we found something else. It's a diary locked in a drawer. The key was still in Graves's pocket. Poirot took the leather-bound volume with great care, flipping it open with a reverence usually reserved for rare manuscripts. The last entry was written in a hurried scrawl. I know who it is, but I cannot prove it yet. If I am right, I will not live to see another day. Poirot must know the truth, Poirot exhaled softly. He knew. I shivered. Then why didn't he tell
Us in the letter? Poirot's gaze did not leave the page. Because, Hastings, he did not have time.
The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thick with unspoken words. Poirot straightened. We are dealing with a most calculating mind, a killer who was willing to silence a man of the law before he could speak. Rowley grunted. But why leave? The chess piece? That's what I can't figure. Poirot's lips curled slightly.
But that is where you and I differ, Chief Inspector. For me, the greatest clue is always that which seems the most inexplicable. He turned to me. Come, Hastings, we have much to consider. But we've only just begun, I protested.
What about the diary? The suspects Graves mentioned? Poirot tapped the cover. Ah, mon cher, patience. One must not rush a game of chess. As we stepped outside, the afternoon light had dimmed, casting long shadows across the lane. I looked, back at the cottage, where the silent figure of Graves remained in his study, forever frozen in the midst of an unfinished game. Poirot's voice was quiet. The question is not only who killed him, Hastings, but why Graves believed he could not prevent his own murder. A chill passed through me, and somewhere, unseen, the murderer's game continued. Chapter 3. The suspects assemble. The study, now devoid of its former occupant's presence, bore the unmistakable air of unfinished business. Poirot stood by the writing desk, fingers pressed together, his eyes lingering on the black king chess piece. His mind, I knew, was already setting the board, arranging the pieces, determining which of our suspects would make the first move. Murder is always personal, Hastings, he murmured.
Even when it appears otherwise. I shivered slightly, still shaken by the sight of Graves slumped over his desk. But how could it be personal? He was an inspector. He must have made many enemies in his time. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. Just a moment. And yet, this is not the work of a distant enemy striking from the shadows. This, mon ami, is a crime of calculation, of intent. He tapped the desk lightly. This chess piece, it is a message.
What sort of message? That, Hastings, we must discover. But first, let us meet those who might wish Graves dead. The drawing-room of the cottage had been hastily repurposed for Poirot's interviews. A fire flickered in the grate, though it did little to dispel the damp chill in the air. A tray of untouched tea sat on a side table, cups long since gone cold. First to arrive was Lady Eleanor Graves. She was tall and striking, with the composure of a woman accustomed to playing hostess, even under the most tragic of circumstances. Dressed in a deep blue morning gown, she inclined her head toward Poirot with a poise that bordered on disinterest. My husband and I lived largely separate lives, she said coolly. His work consumed him. Poirot studied her. And yet, madame, you remained in the village, in this quiet life, after his retirement? I had nowhere else to go, Monsieur Poirot. My family is long gone. Harold was pragmatic. We made an arrangement I entertained, played my role, and he did his work. We did not intrude upon one another. Did he confide in you? She gave a short, bitter laugh. Hardly. Whatever my husband feared, he did not share it with me. Poirot nodded, his gaze flickering toward her gloved hands, resting too still in her lap. And where were you last night, madame? In my bedroom, reading. No one can confirm this? She lifted her chin. I do not require an alibi, Monsieur Poirot. I am not in the habit of murdering my husband, Poirot simply smiled. Naturellement. As Lady Eleanor took her leave, the door opened again, and Dr. Lionel Kent stepped in. A wiry man in his 50s, he removed his spectacles and polished them with quick, nervous movements. Horrible business, absolutely horrible, he muttered. I saw him not 3 days ago. He seemed agitated, but I assumed it was some trivial concern. Poirot raised an eyebrow. A man fears for his life, and you consider it trivial? Kent flushed. I only meant he was often like that, worrying over something or another. You must understand, Graves wasn't a man who shared his troubles. And yet, Doctor, you were close, were you not? I treated him, yes, and his wife, and half the village for that matter. Where were you last night? Kent hesitated. At home, alone. No one can confirm this? The doctor's jaw tightened. I'm afraid not. Poirot merely inclined his head. Next was Roger Caldwell, a former police officer turned pub owner, with a sour expression and a perpetual sneer. He slouched into the chair opposite Poirot, arms crossed. You were dismissed from the force, were you not? Poirot asked pleasantly. Caldwell's expression darkened. That was years ago. Graves ruined my career, yes. Thought he was better than me, but I didn't kill him. Where were you last night? At the King's Arms, running my business. Plenty of people saw me. Poirot did not press him further, but made a mental note. Maggie Ross, the housekeeper, was next. A frail woman with kind eyes. She trembled as she spoke. I found him, sir. I came in this morning as usual, and there he was. She pressed a handkerchief to her lips. I can't imagine who would do such a thing. Poirot studied her. Did he confide in you? Oh, no, sir. But he was troubled. He hardly ate. Spent long hours in his study, writing. He was frightened, I think. You live in the village? Yes, sir. I was at home last night. My neighbour saw me return just after 7. Poirot nodded approvingly. Last was Arthur Sinclair, a solicitor with sharp features and an air of quiet confidence. He shook Poirot's hand firmly before sitting. Mr. Sinclair, Poirot began, you handled legal matters for Graves? Yes. His will, his finances. He recently made adjustments. Poirot leaned forward. Adjustments, you say? Sinclair hesitated. I'm afraid I can't disclose the details. Poirot smiled. Mais oui, you are bound by duty. But perhaps you will answer this. Who benefits most from his death? Sinclair frowned. That I cannot say. Poirot tapped his fingers against the armrest. Bien. As Sinclair departed, I turned to Poirot. Each has an alibi, or nearly so, and yet none feel quite right. Poirot's expression was unreadable. Ah, Hastings, have you not seen it? Seen what? The pattern. The game is in motion. He reached for Graves's diary and flipped through the pages. His finger stopped at an entry. The corruption runs deeper than I thought. It is not one man. It is many. Poirot's voice was quiet. His last case was no ordinary one. It was a war, Hastings. And he did not realize until too late he was fighting alone. The fire crackled. The room felt colder. Outside, the village remained still, but somewhere, unseen, the
murderer was watching.
Chapter 4. the chess clue and another attempted murder. The evening air hung thick with moisture as a fine mist settled over the village. Poirot and I remained in Graves's study, the weight of the day's revelations pressing heavily upon us. The black king chess piece lay in the centre of the desk, small yet commanding, a silent testament to the killer's mind. Poirot had been staring at it for several minutes, his fingertips pressed together in deep contemplation. "A chess piece, Hastings," he murmured at last, his voice barely above a whisper. "A symbol of strategy, of intelligence, of control."
Message, I offered. He inclined his head slightly. "Oui, but from whom?" I shifted uneasily. "It could mean many things. A challenge? A warning? Perhaps both." Poirot lifted the chess piece delicately between thumb and forefinger. "The king is black. That is important." "How so?" He gave me a knowing smile. "You think in terms of simple cause and
Effect, mon ami, but a crime, a real crime, is a tapestry of motives, a game within a game." He placed the chess piece back down. Who would wish to leave such a message for Graves? And why? I frowned. He had many enemies. Poirot tapped the desk lightly. "Ah, but this was not left before the murder, it was placed after," I started. "You mean the killer had time to arrange the scene?" He nodded. "Mais oui, the killer wanted us to see this piece. And yet, Hastings, the great mystery is not what is here, but what is missing." I hesitated. "What do you mean?" Poirot gestured toward the papers on Graves' desk. "His diary, yes, we found it. But tell me, Hastings, does it not strike you as odd that a man fearing for his life, a man with enemies, should leave behind no letters? No personal effects hinting at his private thoughts? It is too curated." I swallowed hard. "You think the murderer took something?" Poirot's
eyes gleamed. "Not just something, Hastings, something vital."
At that moment, the distant chime of the village clock rang through the still night air. Poirot sighed and rose from his seat. "Come, mon ami, we must rest. Tomorrow the game continues." But rest was not to be had. The piercing sound of a scream shattered the night. Poirot was on his feet instantly, already moving toward the door. I followed, my heart pounding. The sound had come from the Graves residence, from the upper floor. As we ascended the stairs two at a time, I saw
Maggie Ross, the housekeeper, standing outside a bedroom door, her face ashen. "It's Lady Eleanor," she cried. She collapsed."
Poirot wasted no time, pushing the door open and striding inside. The room was dimly lit by a single bedside lamp. Lady Eleanor lay sprawled on the floor, her elegant nightgown twisted around her legs. A silver tray had overturned beside her, a teacup shattered upon the carpet. Poirot knelt beside her, fingers lightly pressing against her wrist. "She lives," he murmured, "but just barely." Dr. Kent arrived moments later, summoned by the commotion. He checked her pulse, his mouth set in a grim line. "Poison," he announced, "though I don't know what kind yet." Poirot studied him closely. "She will recover?" Kent exhaled. "It's difficult to say. We must move quickly." Together we lifted Lady Eleanor onto the bed, Kent working swiftly to administer aid. Poirot, however, remained still, his sharp eyes sweeping
"The room."
I knew that look. "Poirot?" I ventured. He held up a hand for silence. Then, very deliberately, he bent down and picked something up from the carpet. It was a tiny glass vial, empty. Poirot examined it, then turned to Dr. Kent. "Tell me, Doctor, does it not strike you as strange that the poison, was delivered so obviously? Kent frowned. Obviously? Poirot held up the vial. Voila! A bottle, left in plain sight? No, no, mon ami, this is clumsy, this is deliberate. I felt
a chill creep over me.
You mean? Yes, Hastings, Poirot said quietly. This was not an attempt at murder. This was a performance. I stared at him. You think Lady Eleanor poisoned herself? Perhaps. Or perhaps someone wished for us to believe. That? Kent shook his head. She's in no condition to stage something like this. Whatever it was, it nearly killed her. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, nearly. Silence stretched between us. Then Poirot straightened, his voice calm but certain. We must proceed carefully, mes amis. The killer is watching. And somewhere, out in the night, I felt certain he was right. Chapter 5. The Secret of the Diary. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the study, casting long shadows across the wooden desk where Graves had met his untimely end. Poirot sat with his hands steepled, his gaze fixed upon the diary in front of him. It was a small, leather-bound volume, worn at the edges, its pages filled with neat, meticulous handwriting. I stood nearby, watching as he carefully turned the pages, his expression unreadable. A man with no face, I murmured, recalling what little we had gleaned from our initial search through the diary. What do you suppose he meant, Poirot? Poirot tapped a fingertip against his temple. It is an evocative phrase, Hastings, no? A man with no face, it suggests anonymity, something unknown, or perhaps deliberately obscured. Eves must have been frightened, I said, peering over his shoulder at the pages. It's clear he felt he was being watched. Poirot did not respond immediately. He flipped another page, his keen eyes narrowing. Then abruptly he stopped. Regardez, Hastings, do you see? I leaned in. What am I looking for? Poirot tapped the paper lightly. A torn page, mon ami, a very particular torn page. Indeed, there was a jagged edge where a sheet had been ripped from the binding. The surrounding pages were intact, their lines of text flowing uninterrupted, but this missing page had been taken with force. Someone removed it, I said. Poirot nodded. And they did so after the murder. You recall, Hastings, that I remarked last night there was something missing from this room. Here is the proof. But why only one page? I asked. Surely, if there was something incriminating, Graves might have written about it more than once.
Ah, but there is the brilliance of the criminal mind, Poirot said softly. A single page, removed with care, does not attract attention in the same way as an entirely missing journal. I frowned. So whatever was written here must
have been important. Poirot closed the diary gently. Oui, très important. He looked up at me, his expression thoughtful. Tell me, Hastings, do you recall how Graves wrote about this mysterious man with no face? I nodded. Yes, but not much detail beyond the fact that Graves felt he was being followed. Precisely. Which means that whatever was on the missing page, it must have contained something more, perhaps a name, perhaps a description, or even a connection. The weight of this realization settled heavily between us. I shuddered at the thought that Graves had, in his final days, been desperate to capture something vital, something worth killing for. Poirot stood abruptly. We must speak with Lady Eleanor. She's barely recovered, I reminded him. All the more reason, he replied. If this so-called poisoning was indeed a ruse, then I suspect it was meant to prevent her from telling us something. And if it was a genuine attempt on her life. He paused, eyes darkening. Then the murderer fears she knows too much. We made our way up the stairs where Maggie Ross met us at Lady Eleanor's door. The housekeeper looked weary, her
hands wringing a small cloth. She's awake, she informed us.
Dr. Kent said she's still weak, but she insisted on seeing you. Poirot gave her a polite nod. Merci, Mademoiselle Ross. We shall not tire her. We stepped inside. The room smelled of lavender and faintly of medicine. Lady Eleanor was propped up against a mound of pillows, her complexion still pale, but her dark eyes sharp. Monsieur Poirot, she greeted weakly. And Captain Hastings? My lady, Poirot said gently, taking a seat beside the bed. It is good to see you awake. You have had a most unpleasant ordeal. She gave a faint smile. An understatement, I'm sure. Poirot wasted no time. Tell me, madam, before you were taken ill last night, did you see or hear anything unusual? She hesitated. Nothing. Nothing specific. But I had a feeling. A feeling? I repeated. She met my gaze. Yes. You may think me foolish.
But I felt as though someone was in the house, I started. What? But we were here the whole time, she shook her head. I don't mean in the open.
But I had the distinct impression I was being watched. Then, when I drank my tea, her fingers trembled slightly. I remember a bitter taste. And then, nothing. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And before yesterday, Lady Eleanor, did your husband ever mention a missing page from his diary? Her face changed. A flicker of alarm crossed her features, quickly masked. No, I don't think so, she said, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. Poirot did not press her. Instead, he merely studied her for a long moment, then smiled kindly. Rest, madame. We shall speak again soon. We left the room, but the moment the door closed behind us, Poirot exhaled sharply. She knows more than she admits. She hesitated, I agreed. Poirot nodded. And a woman in her condition does not waste energy on falsehoods unless she
deems it necessary. I folded my arms. So what do we do now? Poirot's eyes gleamed. We find the missing page. My heart pounded. But where? He tapped his temple. Where indeed? Ah, Hastings, do not worry. Already I have my suspicions. For now, we must tread carefully. As we turned to descend the staircase, a sudden noise echoed from downstairs, the distinct sound of breaking glass. Poirot tensed. Come, Hastings. Vite! We hurried down, reaching the study just in time to see the heavy curtains billowing in the morning breeze.
The window had been shattered, the fragments glistening on the floor, and on Graves' desk, where the diary had rested just moments before, nothing. The diary was gone. Poirot let out a soft sigh, his expression unreadable. The game, it seems, has just begun. Chapter 6. The Case of the Missing Letter. The morning light streamed through the broken window of Inspector Graves's study, illuminating the scattered glass shards on the floor. Poirot stood motionless before the now empty desk, his expression unreadable. The diary, the single most important clue in the case, had vanished. Hastings, who had rushed into the room beside him, was still catching his breath. Poirot! The diary, it's gone, Poirot exhaled slowly. Mais oui, Hastings, that much is evident. His keen eyes swept the room, taking in every detail. The edges of the curtain still trembled from the disturbance, and the footprints in the dust near. The window were fresh. Someone had moved swiftly, silently, and with purpose. Hastings ran a hand through his hair, still flustered. Whoever it was must have been watching us, waiting for the right moment. Poirot nodded. It would seem so, and yet, mon ami, this act of theft is most revealing. Hastings frowned. Revealing? How? Poirot turned to face him. It tells us that the diary contained something of great importance, something our murderer was desperate to hide. Hastings' brows furrowed. But we don't even know what was on the missing page. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, but someone does, and they have just betrayed themselves. At that moment, a hesitant knock sounded at the door. Maggie Ross, the housekeeper, stood in the hallway, her hands twisting in her apron. "Begging your pardon, sirs, but I remembered something." Poirot turned toward her, his expression kind but watchful. "Mademoiselle Ross, parfait. Come in, if you please." She stepped inside, casting a wary glance at the broken window. "I didn't think much of it at first, but now, well, it seems important. Inspector Graves received a letter the day before he died. It was delivered by the afternoon post." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "A letter, you say? Très intéressant. And what became of it?" She hesitated. "I don't know, sir. He read it right away, looked awful troubled by it. But then he tucked it into his pocket and said no more about it." Hastings leaned forward. "Did you see the envelope? Was there a name or return address?" Maggie shook her head. "I only saw it for a moment. It was a plain envelope, I think, and I don't know what he did with it after that." Poirot steepled his fingers, his gaze intent. "Tell me, mademoiselle, did the inspector receive correspondence often?" She hesitated before replying. "Not really, sir. Not since retiring. That's why it stuck in my mind. It was unusual." Poirot
nodded. "And yet the letter is gone." His fingers tapped lightly against his chin. "Mon Dieu, it is a pattern, Hastings. First, the missing page from the diary. Now the missing letter. Do you not see?" Hastings frowned. "I see that."
Someone is going to great lengths to cover their tracks. Poirot gave a small smile. "Oui, and yet these very actions illuminate the truth. Le criminel seeks to conceal, but in doing so, they reveal their fear." Maggie glanced between them, uncertain. "Do you think the letter held a clue to who killed him?" Poirot's expression softened. "I think, Mademoiselle Ross, that Inspector Graves knew his murderer, and that he had begun to collect proof of their guilt." Hastings exhaled sharply. "Then the letter, it must have been a warning." Poirot nodded. "Perhaps, or perhaps it was a confirmation. Either way, someone feared what Graves had uncovered." He turned back to Maggie. "Think carefully, mademoiselle. Is there anyone who might have had access to that letter, someone who could have taken it?" She bit her lip. "Well, Lady Eleanor, maybe. She was with the inspector that afternoon, and Dr. Kent stopped by to check on him that
evening, though I didn't see him with any letters."
Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Très bien. You have been most helpful, Mademoiselle Ross." As she excused herself, Hastings let out a low whistle. "So we've got 2 missing clues, Poirot. What's our next step?" Poirot's gaze drifted toward the shattered window. "We must discover what Graves knew. And to do that, we must retrace his final hours." And with that, the great detective set his mind to unraveling the case before the murderer could strike again. Chapter 7. A Strange Behaviour and a Red Herring. A faint drizzle had begun to fall as Poirot and I walked toward the village clinic. The day's events weighed heavily on my mind. The missing letter, the stolen diary page, the elusive nature of our unseen murderer. And now a visit to Dr. Kent, whose behaviour had been nothing short of peculiar. "I must say, Poirot, the good doctor seemed quite put out when we mentioned the night of the murder," I said. "I wonder what he's hiding." Poirot tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Hastings, a man does not become put out, as you say, without reason. Mais pourquoi? That is what we must determine." The clinic, a modest brick building, with ivy creeping along its walls, stood at the end of a narrow lane. The brass sign beside the door read, "Dr. Lionel Kent, General Practitioner." Poirot rapped twice, and a moment later the door creaked open. Dr. Kent himself answered, his face pale, his collar slightly askew. His gaze flitted between us, and for the briefest moment I thought I detected something. Unease. "Fear, monsieur?" he said, forcing a smile. "A surprise visit, I see." "Indeed, doctor," Poirot said smoothly, stepping inside. "You will forgive the intrusion, but we had a few questions about the night of Inspector Graves' unfortunate demise." Dr. Kent swallowed. "Of course. Come in." The clinic's interior was stark, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic. We were ushered into his consultation room, where he gestured for us to sit. Poirot remained standing. "Tell me, doctor, what time did you last see Inspector Graves on the evening in question?" Dr. Kent shifted uncomfortably. "It must have been around 7 o'clock. I had stopped by to check on him." "Check on him?" I repeated. "Was he ill?" The doctor hesitated, then shook his head. No, he had been feeling a little under the weather. Stress, I imagine. I was merely being cautious." Poirot studied him for a moment. "And you remained? For how long?" "Only 15 minutes. I left at 7:15. Poirot's gaze did not waver. "And after that you returned home?" A pause. "Yes," I frowned. "Can anyone confirm that?" Dr. Kent's fingers drummed lightly against the desk. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Beckett, was out that evening, but—"
"I assure you I was at home." Poirot's expression did not change, but I could tell he had noted the vagueness of the answer.
Before he could respond, however, a hurried knock came at the door. A moment later, a nurse burst into the room, her face flushed. "Doctor, there's been an incident at the Graves estate, Mr. Caldwell." Poirot was already moving. By the time we reached the estate, the study was in complete disarray. Papers lay strewn across the floor, and in the centre of it all stood Roger Caldwell, his fingers smudged with ash, a half-burnt photograph clutched in his hands. Inspector Hewson, the local officer, had arrived moments earlier and was regarding Caldwell with the kind of look usually reserved for confirmed criminals. "Caught him red-handed," Hewson muttered as we entered. "Trying to burn evidence, he was." Poirot stepped forward. "Ah, but quel dommage, my dear Caldwell. You did not succeed, n'est-ce pas?" Caldwell scowled. "This has nothing to do with Graves's murder." Poirot's gaze dropped to the charred photograph. He plucked it from Caldwell's grasp, turning it over delicately. The edges were blackened, but the image remained visible, a group of men in formal wear, standing together at some event. Inspector Graves was among them. "What is this?" I asked. Caldwell hesitated. "Something I should have destroyed long ago." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, mais oui. A thing that should have been destroyed but was not. And now, someone else seeks to keep it hidden." Caldwell swallowed. "I don't know who killed Graves, but I know I'm next." Silence filled the room. Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. "Mon cher monsieur, why do you believe this?" Caldwell exhaled shakily. "Because this," he gestured at the photograph, "this is what got Graves killed. And if they know I've seen it, they won't stop until I'm dead too." Poirot turned the photograph over again. There, in the lower corner, something was written in faded ink, a date, a name, a connection. Poirot's voice was calm, yet firm. Then, my dear Caldwell, I suggest you tell us everything before it is too late. Chapter 8. A Secret Rendezvous. The evening air was damp and carried the faint scent of earth and distant rain. Poirot and I made our way to the small cottage where Margaret Ross resided, just beyond the outskirts of the village. The housekeeper had been reluctant to meet, but Poirot's gentle insistence had worn her down. The cottage itself was modest but well kept, its windows glowing faintly from the light of an oil lamp within. Poirot rapped twice upon the door, and after a brief pause it creaked open. Margaret Ross peered out cautiously, her sharp eyes darting between us. "Quickly, then," she whispered, stepping aside to let us enter. Inside, the room was small and sparsely furnished. A sturdy wooden table stood in the centre, and a single chair had been pulled up near the fire. Margaret gestured toward it, though she herself remained standing. Poirot took a moment to remove his hat and gloves before speaking. "Mademoiselle, I thank you for agreeing to this meeting. It is not easy, n'est-ce pas, to hold secrets so heavy upon the heart." Margaret's fingers tightened around the edge of her apron. "I don't know what you mean," Poirot tilted his head. "Ah, but I think you do. You see, Mademoiselle Ross, I have made a little observation, yes? You are afraid. But not of me, nor of Hastings here. No, you fear something or someone else entirely." Margaret's mouth tightened. For a moment I thought she would refuse to speak, but at last she exhaled a shaky breath. "I don't know much," she murmured. "Only that Inspector Graves was keeping something back. He had a hold over someone, and he wasn't afraid to use it." "A hold?" I repeated. "You mean he was blackmailing someone?" A small, hesitant nod. Poirot's expression did not change, but I could see the sharpness in his eyes. "Alors, that is most illuminating. Tell me, mademoiselle, did Graves ever mention a name?" Margaret shook her head. "No, but I think it had something to do with the letters he kept locked away. I caught him once, going through them late at night. He was muttering to himself, something about making sure they paid their debts." "The letters," Poirot murmured. "Très intéressant." I frowned. But if Graves was blackmailing someone, wouldn't they have come forward by now? I mean, surely they'd want their name cleared. Margaret gave me a weary look. "Not if the truth was worse than the crime, sir." A silence settled over the room. Poirot tapped a finger against his chin, lost in thought. Then very softly he said, "A blackmailer often seals his own fate, mon ami." Margaret flinched. "You think that's why he was killed?" Poirot straightened. "Mademoiselle?"
"I do not think. I know, but the who, the how, and the why, they remain to be uncovered." Margaret hesitated. "If I tell you something else, will you promise to keep it quiet?" Poirot spread his hands. "I promise only to seek the
truth." She licked her lips. "The day before Graves was killed, he received a visitor, a man, tall, well-dressed. They argued. I heard raised voices from the study." Poirot's eyes flickered with interest. "And this man, did you see his face?" Margaret hesitated. "No, but I saw his hands. He had a scar across his left knuckles, an old one, deep." I glanced at Poirot, expecting some grand declaration, but he merely nodded. "Merci, mademoiselle. That is most helpful." Margaret exhaled shakily. I just want this to be over." Poirot took his hat from the table. "It will be, mademoiselle, sooner than you think." As we stepped back out into the cool night air, I turned to Poirot. "That scar, do you know who she was talking about?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, Hastings. The pieces of the chessboard, they are moving, but patience, mon ami, all will be revealed in time." And with that, we walked into the night, the shadows of the village stretching long before us. Chapter 9. The Unlocked Door. Mystery. The morning was crisp, the kind of day where the autumn chill had yet to turn bitter, but the promise of winter lurked in the air. Poirot had risen early, his mind occupied with thoughts of the late Inspector Graves and the curious nature of his demise. It was with great deliberation that he announced his intent to revisit the study where the unfortunate man had met his end. I, for one, could not see what more could be learned from it. Had we not examined every inch already? "Ah, Hastings," Poirot said, slipping on his gloves as we crossed the threshold of the Graves' residence. "It is a curious thing, is it not? A door that was locked from the inside, but only after the murder had taken place." I frowned. "Surely that proves the theory of a suicide, old chap. If Graves was alone, he could have locked the door himself. Before, well, you know." Poirot gave a short laugh. "Your English sense of logic, it is always so direct, mon ami. But no, a man does not fear for his life, take elaborate precautions, and then decide to end it all. It is most unnatural, n'est-ce pas?" I had to admit, he had a point. We entered the study, which remained undisturbed since our last visit. The heavy mahogany desk stood in the centre, the ink bottle still uncapped, as though Graves had been interrupted mid-thought. The black king chess piece, the ominous symbol left behind, had been carefully placed under glass by the local constable. Poirot walked with careful precision, his gaze sweeping the room. Then, with a sudden sharpness, he turned to me. "Hastings, regardez! What do you see?" I followed his gesture to the study door. "A door, Poirot, the same one we examined days ago." He sighed, shaking his head. No, you see. But you do not
Observe. Think, what did we assume when we first arrived?
that it was locked from the inside and the key was still in the lock," I replied, recalling the details. "Precisely. But what if I tell you, mon ami, that the door was not locked at all, until after the murder had been committed?" I opened my mouth to object, but found that I had no immediate answer. "But how do you know?" Poirot bent slightly, his fingers tracing the keyhole. "There is no sign of a struggle inside this room, no marks upon the door, no broken hinges. The only logical conclusion is that our murderer entered easily, and yet, after the deed was done, the room was found to be locked. Why? To mislead us?" "Yes."
Hastings, précisément. It is a deliberate trick to make us believe that the crime was impossible. I ran a hand through my hair, still puzzled. But how did they do it? Poirot straightened, his gaze resting upon the desk.
"Let us reconstruct the moment, shall we? Imagine, mon ami, that you are the murderer. You enter this room, perhaps under the guise of friendship, perhaps under duress. There is an argument. Inspector Graves realizes the truth. He understands that you mean to kill him." He walked towards the desk, gesturing as he spoke. A struggle? No, there was no overturned chair, no spilled ink, no marks of a hurried scuffle. So the attack, it was sudden. A blow to the head, perhaps? I shuddered. And then, mon ami, the killer must leave. But they cannot be seen exiting the room. It would give them away. So what do? Poirot's eyes gleamed as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a piece of string. "Aha! They locked the door from the outside." I stared at him in disbelief. "That's impossible, Poirot. The key was inside the lock, remember?" "Ah, my dear Hastings, you forget. There are methods, clever ones. Consider, if you will, a string looped through the keyhole, a steady hand turning it from the outside, then snap, the string is pulled free and the key remains in place." I blinked at him. "You mean someone stood outside the door and locked it after they had already left?" "Precisely." Poirot smiled. "And that, mon ami, is how we know that this was no crime of passion, but one of premeditation.
Our murderer is clever, oh, très intelligent, but not so clever as Hercule Poirot. I could not help but shake my head in admiration. And what about the Black King chess piece? That must mean something. Poirot sighed. Oui, it is a message.
But one we do not yet fully understand. A king, placed upon the desk, it suggests power, control. But was it left as a warning? A signature? A challenge? I frowned. A challenge? He nodded. To us, mon ami. To me. His voice lowered slightly. I begin to suspect that this game, cette partie d'échecs, it has been in play far longer than we realized. The weight of his words sent a chill through me. Poirot, usually so sure of himself, had the look of a man deep in thought, a man who had glimpsed the outline of something vast and dangerous. I cleared my throat. So what's our next move? Poirot's gaze was distant. We must return to the suspects. Somewhere, someone holds the final piece of the puzzle, and Hastings, mon ami, I fear the murderer is already watching us, waiting to make their next move. And with that, we left the study, the air behind us feeling heavier than before. Chapter 10. The Deception Unravelled. The air in Lady Eleanor's drawing-room was thick with tension. She sat before us, her hands folded neatly in her lap, yet her rigid posture betrayed her composure. Poirot studied her carefully, his sharp eyes missing nothing. I stood beside him, uneasy with the silence that stretched between them. "Madame," Poirot said at last, his voice as smooth as ever. "You have been keeping secrets." Lady Eleanor's lips pressed together, but she did not respond. "Your husband, Inspector Graves, confided in no one about the threats against him," Poirot continued, his voice light but firm. "No one except you. And yet, rather than share his concerns with the authorities, he chose instead to manufacture TXT.
A spectacle, she exhaled softly. You have no proof of that, Monsieur Poirot? Non. Poirot lifted a brow. Then allow me to present it to you. We have spoken to Margaret Ross, your late husband's housekeeper.
She remembers a letter arriving for Graves the day before his murder, one that has since vanished. But what interests me more, madame, is the meeting you had with Arthur Sinclair that very same night. Her expression flickered, a brief betrayal of nerves before she regained her composure. A secret meeting, Poirot went on, under the cover of darkness.
And what did you discuss, Lady Eleanor? Your husband's little charade, perhaps? She closed her eyes for a moment. Then, as if making a decision, she opened them again and sat straighter. Yes, Monsieur Poirot, it is true. My husband, he was
playing a game. A game? I blurted. But why on earth would he pretend to be in danger? She hesitated. I do not know his full reasoning, but my husband was an ambitious man. He had retired, yes, but he was restless. He longed for one final triumph, one last case that would bring him back into the limelight. He believed that by creating the illusion of a threat, he could draw out a real criminal, someone he suspected of far worse crimes than we knew. Poirot leaned forward, his fingers steepled. And what did Arthur Sinclair have to do with this charade? Lady Eleanor hesitated. Arthur had been helping him, unofficially. Graves suspected corruption, something hidden within the village. He was convinced that if he appeared to be in danger, the real villains would reveal themselves. But he underestimated them, Poirot murmured. Her gaze darkened. Yes. He thought he was in control of the game. He was wrong. Someone decided to silence him for good. A heavy silence settled in the room. Poirot tapped his fingers against the armrest of his chair, deep in thought. Then, just as he opened his mouth to speak again, the door burst open. Uniformed constables stood in the entryway, pale and breathless.
"Monsieur Poirot, Dr. Kent, he's dead!" The words sent a shock through the room. Lady Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Poirot rose swiftly, his face unreadable. "How did he die?" he asked. "Suicide, sir," the constable said grimly. "In his office. Poison." Poirot's eyes flashed with something I could not quite place. Triumph? Disbelief? Then, without another word, he strode out of the house, leaving me scrambling to follow. Dr. Kent's office was as neat and sterile as
one would expect, but the air inside felt oppressive, weighed down by the unmistakable scent of death. The doctor himself was slumped over his desk, his head resting against an overturned glass. A small vial lay beside it, its label unmistakable: morphine. Poirot moved about the scene with careful precision, his sharp gaze sweeping over every detail. He paused, his fingers grazing a sheet of paper left on the desk. "A note?" I asked. Poirot picked it up and read aloud. "I cannot bear the guilt any longer. Forgive me." A cold chill ran through me. "Well, there's our answer, Poirot. The man must have been involved in Graves's murder and couldn't live with himself." Poirot made a sound of disapproval. "Ah, Hastings, you jump too quickly to conclusions. This," he held up the note, "is too perfect." I frowned. "You don't
think he wrote it?" "Oh, he may have written it, mon ami. But did he write it willingly? That is the question." He bent closer to the doctor's face, his expression one of intense concentration. Then, without a word, he stepped back and turned
to the constable. "I need the exact time of death." The man hesitated. "Difficult to say, sir. But he was last seen alive 2 hours ago." Poirot nodded. "And the door, was it locked from the inside?" The constable nodded. "Yes, sir. We had to force it open." Poirot pursed his lips. "Curious, very curious." I exhaled, rubbing my temples. "Poirot, it's a locked room again. How do you explain it?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the window and examined the latch. Then he turned back, his expression unreadable. "Hastings," he said at last, "this is not suicide. It is murder, and the killer has just made their first mistake." I stared at him in shock. "But, Poirot, the room was locked. The note—" Poirot waved a hand. "All meant to deceive us, but, mon ami, la vérité, it has a way of revealing itself. Come, Hastings, we have work to do." And with that, he turned on his heel and strode out, leaving me scrambling, once again, to keep up. Chapter 11. The Truth Behind Graves' Final Case. The streets of the village were quiet as Poirot and I made our way back from Dr. Kent's office, but there was a tension in the air, a sense that something unseen was pressing in on us. Poirot walked briskly, his hands clasped behind his back, his head bowed in deep thought. I struggled to keep pace. "Poirot," I said at last, "if Kent's death was murder, then it must mean one thing: the killer is growing desperate." "Très juste, Hastings," Poirot murmured without looking up. "The net tightens, and like any cornered creature, our assassin is making mistakes." But why Kent? If he wasn't the murderer, what did he know that was worth killing him? Over? Poirot stopped abruptly, turning to me with eyes that gleamed with certainty. "That, mon ami, is precisely the question we must answer. Consider Dr. Kent had no known quarrel with Graves, and yet he is the second to die. That means he stumbled upon something dangerous." I frowned. "Something connected to Graves's last case?" Poirot nodded. Oui, Hastings. I begin to see the shape of it now. We resumed our walk in silence, but I could feel Poirot's mind racing ahead. When we reached our lodgings, he wasted no time in taking out the case files and spreading them across the table. He tapped one finger against a name at the top of the page. Graves' last case before his retirement, Poirot said. A corruption scandal. He was investigating fraudulent dealings in local government, bribery, misappropriation of funds, and yet, before any arrests could be made, he retired. Why? I looked at the documents, trying to make sense of them. Perhaps he was forced out. Poirot's lips twitched. Ah, Hastings, always the direct approach, but no, Graves was not a man to be frightened off so easily. He was calculating. He would have retired only if he had something to gain. He picked up another sheet of paper, this one containing Graves's own notes. And then we have the diary, Poirot mused. The reference to the man with no face. I shuddered. That phrase, it sounds almost supernatural, Poirot scoffed. Pah! There is nothing supernatural about this, my friend. Graves was an investigator. He would not write nonsense in his diary. A man with no face. It means something. Something very specific. I was about to press him for an answer when there was a knock at the door. Poirot straightened. Come in, he called. The door opened to reveal Arthur Sinclair, looking ashen-faced and breathless. He hesitated before stepping inside. Poirot, he said, his voice hoarse, I think I'm in danger. Poirot gestured for him to sit. Tell me, Monsieur Sinclair, why do you believe this? Sinclair swallowed hard. Because I know who Graves was investigating. I leaned forward, startled. You do? Sinclair nodded. I didn't tell you before because I was afraid. But after Dr. Kent... He shook his head. It's all connected, isn't it? Poirot studied him for a long moment before speaking. Go on. Sinclair took a deep breath. Graves was investigating corruption, yes, but he was also blackmailing
someone. He had evidence, documents, proof, and he wasn't going to let it go. I felt my stomach turn. Then, was it about money?
Did he retire because he was paid off? Sinclair hesitated. Not exactly. Graves always wanted control. He wanted leverage over people, and he found it. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Who, Monsieur Sinclair? Who was he blackmailing? Sinclair hesitated again, then finally said, Roger Caldwell. I blinked in disbelief. Caldwell? But he was a disgraced officer. What leverage could Graves possibly have over him? Sinclair shook his head. That's just it. Caldwell wasn't just a disgraced officer. He was involved in Graves's last case. He was the one who supplied Graves with information about the corruption scandal. But instead of being rewarded, he was cast aside. His career was ruined. Poirot's fingers drummed against the table. And so he had reason to resent Graves. Sinclair nodded. Exactly, but that's not all. He took a deep breath. Graves had something else on him, something dangerous. Poirot leaned forward. What was it? Sinclair licked his lips nervously. I don't know. But I do know this. Whatever it was, Graves was using it to control Caldwell. And now Graves is dead, and so is Dr. Kent. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Merci, Monsieur Sinclair. You have been most helpful. Sinclair hesitated. Then you believe me? Poirot smiled faintly. I believe you have given me a very important piece of the puzzle. Sinclair exhaled, relief evident on his face. Then what do I do? Poirot stood. You do nothing, mon ami. Leave this matter to me. Sinclair nodded and left, closing the door behind him. I turned to Poirot. So, what now? Poirot's expression grew serious. Now, Hastings, we pay another visit to Roger Caldwell, and this time we shall demand the truth. Chapter 12. Poirot's Experiment and a Fatal Error. Hastings looked at Poirot with barely concealed bewilderment as the little Belgian arranged the chairs in the drawing-room to mimic the layout of Inspector Graves's study. The suspects had been summoned. Lady Eleanor, Roger Caldwell, Margaret Ross, and Arthur Sinclair stood stiffly in various states of impatience and unease. "My friends," Poirot began, dusting his hands delicately, "we are here to reconstruct
the events of that fateful night. It is an experiment most instructive, n'est-ce pas?" Lady Eleanor, composed as ever, arched an eyebrow.
"I fail to see what this will accomplish, Monsieur Poirot. Surely you already have your theories?" Poirot merely smiled. "Ah, but a theory without proof, madame, is like a soufflé without air. It will collapse most dreadfully." Hastings, who had been tasked with playing the part of Inspector Graves, stood awkwardly near the mock desk Poirot had fashioned from a small side table. "I suppose I'm to be the victim, then?" he said wryly. "An excellent victim you make, mon ami," Poirot said with an approving nod. "Now let us begin. Each of you shall recount your movements on the night of the murder. But first, a reminder. Inspector Graves' body was found seated at his desk, the door locked from within, and beside him, a single chess piece. The
Black King. A curious detail, is it not? There was a murmur among the gathered individuals. Poirot's eyes flicked between them, studying each reaction. Arthur Sinclair, the solicitor, cleared his throat.
"I was at home that evening, preparing documents. My clerk can vouch for me." "A clerk who, I believe, left at 9:30? Poirot interjected smoothly. Sinclair hesitated. "Yes, but—" "Which means you were alone afterward." Poirot turned, inviting the next to speak. "I was in my quarters," Margaret Ross said. "I heard nothing. Inspector Graves often stayed up late reading case files." Roger Caldwell, who had been shifting uncomfortably, spoke up next. "I went to the tavern. You can ask the barman." Poirot's gaze lingered on him. "And yet you were seen near the inspector's residence later that evening." Caldwell scowled. "What of it?" "I had words with the man a few days prior, but I didn't kill him." Poirot nodded thoughtfully and gestured to Lady Eleanor. "And you, madam?" "I was in my room," she replied coolly. Poirot tapped a finger against his lips. "So you claim." The tension in the room thickened. Poirot clasped his hands together. "Now, let us examine a most intriguing aspect of the crime. How was the door locked after the murder? The mechanism could only be secured from within, and yet the murderer escaped." He turned to Hastings. "Mon ami, would you kindly demonstrate how you would have approached the desk, as though you were Inspector Graves on that night?" Hastings complied, pulling out the chair and sitting down. Poirot adjusted a small book on the table to mimic where the chess piece had been found. "Now," Poirot said, turning to the assembled guests, "one of you described the scene of the crime in such a way that you could not possibly have known, unless you were there." The silence was profound. A flicker of recognition crossed Lady Eleanor's face. Roger Caldwell exhaled sharply. Poirot's voice softened, almost regretful. "A fatal error, you see. A careless remark about the position of the chess piece. How it was turned ever so slightly to the left. The police report did not mention this detail, and yet someone in this room knew." A sharp intake of breath. The culprit was about to be revealed. Chapter 13. The Grand Revelation Begins. The atmosphere in the study was thick with anticipation. The suspects sat in uneasy silence, their eyes darting between Poirot and the grand mahogany desk where Inspector Graves had met his untimely end. Poirot stood with his back to the fireplace, his hands neatly clasped before him, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. Hastings, standing to his right, studied the faces of those assembled. Lady Eleanor, pale but composed. Arthur Sinclair, his solicitor's mask firmly in place. Roger Caldwell, tense and fidgeting, and Margaret Ross, whose usually stern demeanour was now tinged with anxiety. Each had their own secrets, their own motives, but only one was the murderer. "My friends," Poirot began, his voice soft yet commanding, "it is time. The mystery of Inspector Graves' death has vexed you all, but to me it was most simple. From the start, the clues told a story not of a hunted man, but of a hunter who became the hunted." Arthur Sinclair leaned forward. "Are you saying Graves was not a victim?" "Precisely, monsieur," Poirot said, nodding. "From the beginning, we were misled. We believed that Graves was a man in danger, receiving death threats from a hidden
enemy. But in truth it was all a deception, a most elaborate charade." Margaret Ross clutched at the folds of her dress. "You mean he faked it all?" Poirot gave a small, approving smile.
"Très bien, mademoiselle. Yes. Graves orchestrated the threats against himself to evoke sympathy, to paint himself as a man under siege. It was a brilliant move, no? He ensured that when he finally did die, everyone would assume it was the culmination of a long-standing plot against him." Lady Eleanor exhaled slowly. "But why would he do such a thing?" "Ah, madame, because Graves was not just a detective but a blackmailer," Poirot said. "He had built a reputation for uncovering secrets, but not for the sake of justice. He used them to his advantage, holding them over the heads of those who had much to lose." His gaze flickered over each person in turn. "That is why so many of you had reason to despise him." There was a collective intake of breath. Poirot let the silence settle before continuing. "But here is where our story takes a most interesting turn," he said. One among you, discovered his deception. And instead of being a victim, Inspector Graves became the target. The murder was no act of malice born from long-standing
hatred. No, it was a calculated response. The murderer turned Graves' own game against him. Hastings, who had been following with increasing fascination, leaned in.
"You mean the killer used Graves' own staged threats to frame someone else?" "Exactly, mon ami." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "It was most clever. When the inspector was found dead, it was assumed his enemy had finally struck. The murderer relied on this assumption, ensuring that suspicion would be cast far and wide, while they themselves remained hidden." Roger Caldwell's voice was hoarse. "And you know who did it?" Poirot gave a small nod. "Oui, the pieces have fallen into place." He stepped forward, his gaze locking onto each suspect. "The locked door, the missing letter, the diary entry about the man with no face. They were all part of the same intricate puzzle. But the true key was the chess piece." Arthur Sinclair frowned. "The Black King? Ah, monsieur, you are a man of law, so tell me, what does the
king represent?"
Sinclair hesitated. "Power, authority." "Just so," Poirot said. "And who in this case held the most power over others?" He let the question hang before answering it himself. "Inspector Graves." There was a murmur among the assembled. Poirot raised a finger. The murderer left that chess piece as a message. It was not merely a token, it was a declaration. The king had been toppled. The blackmailer had been undone. Lady Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper.
"And who did it?"
Poirot turned, his expression grave. "The person who killed Inspector Graves was—" A sudden crash echoed through the room. The suspects jumped as the heavy curtains billowed from a rush of wind. A glass had fallen from the mantelpiece, shattering into fragments on the floor. Hastings stiffened. Poirot, however, merely smiled. "Ah, a most timely interruption, no? But it does not change the truth." He stepped forward and pointed. "The murderer is you." Chapter 14. The Killer Exposed. The room fell into an eerie silence, save for the faint crackling of the fireplace. All eyes were fixed on Poirot, his small but commanding figure standing at the centre of the room like an actor about to deliver the final line of a grand performance. Hastings, standing nearby, felt his pulse quicken as he watched the reactions of the assembled suspect. Arthur Sinclair's face was a perfect mask of neutrality, but Poirot had seen it before, the carefully measured expression of a man accustomed to hiding the truth. Lady Eleanor clutched the arms of her chair, her knuckles pale against the fabric. Roger Caldwell, shifting uneasily, looked as though he was still reeling from the weight of the accusations that had nearly fallen upon him, and Margaret Ross, silent as ever, kept her gaze firmly fixed on Poirot, as if she had known all along that this moment was inevitable. Poirot took a step forward, his voice low but firm. "The murderer is you, Monsieur Arthur Sinclair." A sharp intake of breath passed through the room. Hastings, though he had suspected Sinclair in the past, felt an undeniable thrill at hearing Poirot state it so plainly. Arthur Sinclair did not flinch. Instead, he regarded Poirot with the cool detachment of a man accustomed to courtroom theatrics. "That is quite an accusation, Monsieur Poirot," he said, his voice measured, "and one that I suspect you will struggle to prove." Poirot merely smiled. "On the contrary, monsieur, the proof is all around us. You have, as they say, played your hand." He began pacing the room slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Let us revisit what we know. Inspector Graves was a blackmailer. He had uncovered secrets, many secrets, and he used them to his advantage. But what was the greatest secret he held?" Poirot turned, eyes flashing. "It was yours, monsieur. You, Arthur Sinclair, had been involved in financial fraud. The good inspector had stumbled upon something most compromising, something that could ruin you entirely." Sinclair's lips pressed into a thin line, but he remained silent. Poirot continued. "Graves knew of your deception, and he intended to use it against you, but you, being a man of law, understood the danger. You could not allow him to expose you, and so you devised a most cunning plan. You knew that Graves had been fabricating threats against his own life. What better way to cover your crime than to make it appear as though his deception had backfired?" Margaret Ross let out a small gasp. "Then the real killer turned Graves' trick against him?" "Exactement." Poirot nodded. Monsieur Sinclair saw an opportunity. He waited for the perfect moment to strike, ensuring that all eyes would be on Graves's supposed enemies rather than himself. He used the inspector's own scheme as the perfect smokescreen. Hastings frowned. But how did he manage to frame Caldwell? Poirot's smile was razor-sharp. "Ah, mon ami, that was perhaps his most brilliant stroke. He knew that Graves had enemies, many enemies, but Roger Caldwell? He was the ideal scapegoat, a man with a temper, a history of bad dealings with Graves, and most importantly, a man who would panic under pressure." Roger Caldwell shifted in his seat, looking deeply unsettled. Poirot gestured toward the desk. And yet the most telling clue was the chess piece, the Black King. Arthur Sinclair's mask slipped ever so slightly. A flicker of something, doubt perhaps, passed across his face. "You believed it to be a message from the killer," Poirot continued. "A signature, a taunt. But no, monsieur, the truth is far more poetic. The chess piece was not left by the murderer at all. It was left by Graves himself." A murmur rippled through the room. Poirot allowed the moment to settle before delivering his final revelation. Graves knew in his final moments who had bested him. He had underestimated his opponent. And so, with his last breath, he left the Black King upon the desk, a silent acknowledgment that he had been checkmated. Hastings stared at Poirot in astonishment. Then he knew who his murderer was? "Indeed, mon ami," Poirot said gravely. "And now so do we?" Arthur Sinclair, who had remained composed throughout, finally exhaled. A faint, rueful smile crossed his lips. "Well played, Monsieur Poirot." He adjusted his cuffs, his movements as smooth as ever. "I suppose I should have known better than to underestimate you." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "It is always the same, monsieur. The criminal believes himself to be the cleverest in the room, until he is not." Inspector Japp, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Arthur Sinclair, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Inspector Graves." Sinclair did not resist as the inspector moved toward him. He merely straightened his posture, his expression unreadable. "You know, Poirot," he said, almost conversationally, "I had planned it to be the perfect crime." Poirot allowed himself a small smile. "Ah, but perfection, monsieur, is a most elusive thing." As Japp led Sinclair away, the room remained
heavy with the weight of revelation. Lady Eleanor released a long, shuddering breath. Roger Caldwell buried his face in his hands.
And Margaret Ross, looking utterly drained, murmured, "So it is over?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, mademoiselle, it is over." But as he glanced toward the chessboard on the desk, a shadow of thought flickered across his face. For even as one game had reached its end, another was just beginning. Chapter 15. Justice is served and Poirot's final word. The moment Arthur Sinclair lunged toward the door, there was a sharp cry from Lady Eleanor. But Poirot remained utterly still, as if he had anticipated this last, desperate act. Hastings, however, was caught entirely off guard. "Good heavens, he's making a run for it!" Hastings exclaimed. But Sinclair's flight was short-lived. Before he could reach the hallway, Inspector Japp stepped forward with practiced ease, seizing him by the arm. The solicitor struggled for only a moment, then went still, his body deflating as though he had known all along that there would be no escape. Japp sighed. "Really, Sinclair? You're a man of law, you should know better than to run." Sinclair exhaled sharply, his expression unreadable. "Old habits, Inspector." His voice held a strange, detached amusement. "A cornered man will always test his last route of escape." Poirot moved forward, his sharp eyes fixed on Sinclair. "Oui, monsieur. But this time there was no escape. From the moment the Black King was left upon the desk, your fate was sealed." Sinclair gave a low chuckle. "I suppose I should be flattered. Outwitted by the great Hercule Poirot." He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces. "And to think, Graves believed himself to be the cleverest man
in the room." Poirot's expression was unreadable. "And yet, monsieur, he underestimated the wrong man." Sinclair's smile faded.
There was something final in Poirot's words, an acknowledgment that his carefully laid plan had unravelled in its entirety. Japp motioned to the constable at the door. "Get him out of here." As Sinclair was led away, Margaret Ross let out a long breath, as if she had been holding it in since the moment Poirot had spoken his name. "So it's over," she murmured, echoing the words she had spoken earlier. Poirot inclined his head. "Oui, mademoiselle. It is over." Roger Caldwell, who had been sitting stiffly throughout the revelation, suddenly let out a bitter laugh. "Over, is it? I suppose I should be grateful, but I don't feel particularly relieved." He rubbed a hand over his face. "That man almost got me hanged." Poirot regarded him with a knowing look. "Monsieur, you have had a narrow escape, but I hope you understand the dangers of secrecy. If you had come forward sooner, matters might have been resolved with less distress." Caldwell met Poirot's gaze, then looked away. "I suppose you're right." He exhaled heavily. "I won't make that mistake again." Lady Eleanor, still pale, turned to Poirot. "And Graves? In the end, he was just another villain, wasn't he?" Poirot hesitated, then shook his head. "No, milady, not just another villain. He was a man who played a dangerous game, and in the end he was outplayed." There was a pause. Then Hastings, who had been silent for longer than usual, cleared his throat. "Poirot, your little grey cells have done it again." Poirot's lips twitched. "Mais oui, mon ami. The mind, it is a chessboard, and I never lose a game." He cast one final glance at the desk where the Black King had rested. And this, mon cher Hastings, was a game indeed. As the evening settled into a hush, the drawing-room of Greystone Manor felt strangely hollow without the weight of the crime hanging over it. The assembled guests had dispersed, some in stunned silence, others murmuring in hushed tones about the events that had unfolded. Inspector Japp had left with Arthur Sinclair in custody, and with that, it seemed, the affair was concluded. Hastings, still reeling from the revelations, exhaled as he sank into a chair. "Well, Poirot, you've done it again. Sinclair, of all people. I'll admit I hadn't the faintest suspicion. He carried himself too well." Poirot, adjusting his cuffs, gave a small, knowing smile. "Precisely, mon ami. The criminal mind often prides itself on its own cleverness, but when one plays against Hercule Poirot, one must be very clever indeed." Hastings chuckled and shook his head. "And that chess piece, Graves' way of telling us he'd been beaten at his own game?" "Exactement." Poirot folded his arms, his sharp gaze flickering towards the desk where the Black King had once rested. "The game of deception is a dangerous one. Sinclair believed himself the master, but he did not account for the final move." There was a comfortable silence, only the distant ticking of the grandfather clock filling the space. Poirot, always meticulous, began arranging some loose papers on the desk. Hastings, still in awe of his friend's brilliance, idly ran his fingers along the polished surface of the desk until something unusual caught his attention. A thin, folded sheet of paper wedged between the pages of a leather-bound journal. "Hello, what's this?" Hastings tugged at it, frowning as he unfolded the yellowed paper. It must have been stuck inside Graves's diary all along, the missing page. Poirot turned swiftly, his keen eyes narrowing. "Vraiment?" He took the paper from Hastings, smoothing it out delicately. His eyes scanned the words, his expression shifting ever so slightly, first curiosity, then something more elusive. Hastings, impatient, leaned forward. "Well, Poirot, what does it say?" Poirot's fingers traced the faded ink, and for a moment he seemed to hesitate. Then, ever so carefully, he folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. Hastings frowned. "Poirot?" Poirot turned to his friend, a small, enigmatic smile curving his lips. "Ah, mon cher Hastings! Some secrets, I think, are best left untold. Hastings blinked. But surely if there's something still unknown. Poirot raised a finger. There are always mysteries, even when a case is closed. C'est la vie, mon ami. He took his hat from the table, giving it a light tap against his arm. Come, Hastings, the case is solved, and we must not linger. The train to London awaits. Hastings, though still baffled, sighed and followed Poirot out of the room. Yet, as they stepped into the cool night air, he could not shake the lingering question that hovered in the back of his mind. Had they truly uncovered everything? As they walked toward the car, Poirot looked up at the vast, starlit sky and murmured, more to himself than anyone else, "There is always another player in the game." And with that, they disappeared into the night, leaving Greystone Manor and its ghosts behind.